What's going on, guys? This is Gene Jensen, and if you fish a lake that has a lot of grass in it, or even just a little bit of grass in it, you're going to want to watch this video, so stay tuned. So what I want to talk about is I want to talk about one of my favorite baits to fish grassy lakes, ones that have milfoil and hydrilla, or any other type of submerged or even emergent vegetation, lily pads, stuff like that. My favorite down in Florida, my favorite up in Minnesota and Wisconsin. It's just a lure and a technique that works everywhere there's grass. And that technique is a speed worm, or some type of what I like to call a swimming worm. And let's dive into it. First of all, let's talk about the equipment that I'm going to use to fish this technique. Let's talk about how to choose the right rod. Most lakes have milfoil, hydrilla, or most grassy lakes will have milfoil or hydrilla in them. And that grass is really easy to break and rip things out of and things like that. So I'm gonna go with a medium heavy, moderate or medium heavy fast rod. 7 foot plus, just because you wanna make long casts and all this other stuff, but mainly just the medium heavy, moderate, medium heavy, fast. Reel is gonna be like an 8:3 to 1 gear ratio reel. And then I'm going to have 15, 17, or 20 pound test on my rod, usually 15 or 17. When I bump it up to 20, I'll also bump the rod up to a heavy power rod, especially down here in Florida. They've got all this Kissimmee grass that's really, really hard to break and really hard to tear, and you get snagged in it a lot. And I literally would lose my religion if I tried to fish a medium rod. So fluorocarbon line is a must. A lot of the times when you get hydrilla and milfoil, you're fishing around clear water. That grass is a filter. It filters out all the murky and muckiness of the water, and it makes the water around it really, really clear. This isn't a heavy sinker technique, okay? The heaviest weight that I'm gonna use is gonna be a 1/4 ounce, okay? 3/16 is the next one down, and then the smallest one I'm probably gonna use is a small little 1/8 ounce weight. And the reason is the heavier weight you use as you're working this bait through the grass, if it's heavy, it's gonna fall down into the grass and it's gonna get hung up a whole lot more. What you wanna do with it is you're dragging it and working it over top and on top of the grass and letting it fall down into holes and stuff like that. So you really don't want a heavy weight. Another thing you're gonna want is a punch stop, or a bobber stopper, as they call it. You guys see that right there? Pick up a package of these, 2 or 3 or 4 of these, and use them. Put them. As a matter of fact, it's the first thing you put on the line is a little keeper, a little bobber stopper. Okay, put that on the line, then put the sinker, then put the hook, snug it down, and that's just like that. Now the hook, I'm going to use a 4/0 and straight shank. You can use a wide gap, you could use an offset hook. Offset hooks tend to get it snagged a little bit more, but it's really not that big of a deal. But I like a 3/0 or a 4/0 hook for most of these worms. If I'm fishing these big heavy worms, then I'm going to go to a 5/0. Okay, so let's talk about the worms themselves. When I say swimming worm, I say any type of a straight worm that has some type of a tail on the end of it that causes it to swim or to flutter, have some type of a tail. Even a paddle tail, something like the Yamamoto Swim Cinco and stuff like that. That's one of the ones I used to use years and years ago. Other ones are the Zoom Ultra Vibe Speed Worm, as they call it. Another one of my favorites is the cutter worm. Now the cutter worm doesn't have a hook tail. This is the Rage cutter worm, and this is the big one, the Magnum, but it has a little cut tail, okay? And there are other baits that are called cut tail worms as well. I know Yamamoto has a cut tail. And then here's one I want to talk about. I'm down here in Florida, and I always like to go by the local tackle shops and pick up local baits. But the Bridgemasters U-tail worm has got a ton of action. I love it when I'm down here in Florida, but that's kind of what I'm talking about. A straight worm, almost looks like a Cinco, with some type of a kick in or a swimming worm at the end. All right, so let's talk about the places I'm looking for to fish this thing. Now, the worst place to fish it, and the place that I have the least amount of luck, is a place that has solid grass, no holes, no nothing, just solid milfoil, solid hydrilla, no holes to be able to drop this thing down into and things like that. I don't fish that area. The area I'm looking for is a place that has big clumps, scattered clumps of grass. And you'll know what I'm talking about when you see it. But anything that has like a clump and then a hole, or a clump and then there's a hole and there's space in between and things like that, I am always going to grab this rig, okay? And I'm gonna start off with an 1/8 ounce sinker. And if I feel like I need to keep it down a little bit deeper or things like that, I'll go up to a 3/16, and then last but not least, a 1/4 ounce. But I always try to start lightweight. Other place I'm looking for is where you're in an area that just has little stems of grass everywhere. It's like a big sheet of shallow or grass that's not growing very high off the bottom, but it has shoots coming off of it that are a little bit taller and can be even 12 to 18 inches taller. And I'm just going to cast it out and bring it in and swim it through there, or I'm going to drag it through there. We'll talk about that in a minute. So those are the kind of areas that I'm looking for. I've got to have scattered stuff. Another thing, like down here in Florida, lily pads. It's a perfect bait to cast into the lily pads or into small clumps of lily pads and swim it or drag it through those lily pads, especially the spatterdock that's down here in Florida. The bass love to spawn on those spatterdock roots, and so you can drag it through those roots and be able to get it into their bedding areas, and it's pretty weedless. Let me think if I can think of anybody else. Another thing I love to do with it is if I do have like this Kissimmee grass or some type of an emergent grass that comes out of the water, I will swim it through the top of it. So it's kind of like a top water bait. Throw it out, swim it on through really, really slow, and keep that, it'll stay up on top, but keep that thing just sputtering. And if there's holes in that emergent vegetation and the bass are in those holes, they'll come up and hit it. All right, so there's a couple different ways that you can fish the speed worm. First of all, when you've got that scattered clumpy grass, you've got got any type of grass where you can work it real slowly and carefully around it, that's kind of what you want to do. And you want to drag it through it. So what I'm doing is I'll cast it out and I'll let it sink down to the bottom, or let it sink down to where it stops. And then I'm just going to slowly drag it over top of all that vegetation and just, well, I say slowly, but it's not, I'm not going to let it stop or anything else. I'm going to kind of just hop it through that vegetation and get it around into those holes. Okay. The other option is to cast it out, let it sink down till it stops. And then I'm just going to slowly reel it. And as I feel it pop over some grass, I'm just going to just jerk it through the grass just a little bit with my wrist. You see that? See what I'm doing there? Just bonk. And it gets it on through. And if you get it hung up and you can't pull it through with just your wrist, then you just take it and you give it one big slack line pop. The goal is to try to keep that worm, when you're pulling it through that grass, try to keep that worm from getting too far away from the grass. You want to pull it up to something where it snags and barely pop it over top of it and let it fall back down. A lot of times what you're doing is you're out on the top of a clump of grass and you're popping it over top, and when you let it slack, let the line slack and let it fall back down, it falls down into a hole, and that's where the bass are hanging out. That's where they're sitting there waiting to ambush whatever comes by. Okay, and say I've got the kind of grass that that has emergent vegetation or has emergent stuff on it. Okay, and I want to fish over top of it. I'm just going to cast it out, and I leave it just below the surface until it hits something that pops over. I don't typically like to fish it directly on top. I like to fish it an inch or so underneath. I'm just going to cast it out, and you see I'm just reeling it as fast as I need to keep it up a little bit, and then it comes across that vegetation. I'm telling you, and the strikes are atrocious. They're amazing when they hit those things, but make sure you treat it like top water. When you see that strike or see that boil, give it 2 or 3 seconds before you set the hook, or you're going to jerk it out of their mouth. That's the biggest thing when you're fishing up in that upper part of the water column, is you've got to really, if you can see the strike, you've got to let them take it for a minute. All right, so in the early spring, when the bass are moving up to spawn and stuff like that, if you find an area that the bass are spawning in, an area of grass that has holes in it and they're spawning in those holes, One of the things you want to make sure that you do is you want to make sure that once you pop it into that hole, don't move it very much. You don't want to speed through that hole. You want to drag it super slow, or you just want to shake it a little bit and work that hole for as long as you possibly can. And then just keep throwing into it. When they're in there spawning and stuff like that, they're really aggressive. They're really protective. They're not so much feeding, so they may or may not grab the hook, and you'll get a lot of missed hook sets, but keep throwing it into those holes, and you'll eventually get them to bite and get a hook up. But like I always say, be sure to introduce somebody to fishing, introduce them to my channel. Let me help you teach them how to fish. More importantly, get out of the water, go out and catch some fish, and have a great day. We'll see you.